This week, I sit down with Tony Roach and we talk about finding and catching fish in weeds, jigging wrap tactics, and how to choose the right color crankbait. Welcome to this week's episode of Ask the Buzz, the show where you send us your fishing questions and we answer them. I'm Nick Linder, and this week I have with me Mr. Tony Roach, who is a Minnesota fishing guide. And I went through a few of the questions you guys have been sending us over the last few weeks, and I got a few that I think Tony might do a good job addressing, so I guess we'll jump right in here. The first question that I think would be a good one here was from Paul Tiffany, and he asks, I've heard that green weeds are key to finding fish in fall and winter. Sometimes I hear that even brown weeds will hold some fish. What is the most efficient way to find those good weeds in fall?
That's a great question. You know, there's a lot of vegetation and a lot of bodies of water hold fish at different times of the year. Vegetation's obviously structure, and I fish a lot of weeds. You know, I start with my electronics. You know, I use my electronics to find a lot of that tall standing stock cabbage. You know, a lot of those fish will relate to those weed lines because they hold bait fish. You know, that's a great spot for walleyes to sit and ambush prey. You know, walleyes are ambush predators, so they'll sit inside those green weeds, and a lot of times it tends to be that standing stock cabbage that still survives. But certainly, you know, dead vegetation, also coontail, I should say, but some dead vegetation mixed in with those green weeds are fine as well. But if you use your electronics, you're going to find those weeds much quicker than if you're just blind casting along the edge trying to snag a weed. I'll put my structure scan on and I'll actually drive through an area until I mark those weeds, and then boom, I'll just put icons down. What's great about modern day electronics is if you're using a structure scan, you can generally drive around and either touch the screen or scroll to that exact specific spot on the screen where you're seeing that vegetation, mark it with a waypoint, and then you can come back and cast those areas.
All right, that's some very good stuff. Now, when you are targeting these weeds in fall, what presentations are you usually using?
You know, I love fishing jigs and plastics, jigs and minnows. You know, earlier in the fall when things are still progressing and the water temperatures are relatively warm, I love pitching either crankbaits or jigs and plastics, because with that I can fish fast. You know, I can work weed line edges, I can keep moving, I can put waypoints down on the spots where I'm catching fish, keep moving, and then circle back through those spots with different presentations. Now, as that surface temperature and water temps start to cool, I tend to slow down my presentation. So not to say you have to get away from crankbaits or get away from jigs, but sometimes I'll slow down a little bit and I'll fish with those same presentations, but I'll just slow my cadence down when I'm reeling in a crankbait or when I'm ripping a plastic through those areas. Instead of aggressively fishing that plastic, I'll slow it down, even to the point where I know where I've marked fish, I know where I've caught fish. I'll even come back through with live bait and actually let it sit on the bottom, twitch it, let it pause, twitch it, let it pause. That way you're covering all aspects of fishing, if you will. You're fishing aggressive, you're slowing it down, you're figuring out what the fish want, and that's always key in any fishing situation. But in particular in the fall, because you're going to get some fish that are extremely aggressive right off the get-go, even though the surface temperatures may be cool, and then you're going to get those less aggressive fish that are sitting down in the weeds. Walleyes are notorious you know, ambush predators. So you might have some of these big girls that aren't quite as aggressive. They're not hitting a crankbait or a plastic, but boom, they'll hit a jig and a minnow that's presented right in front of their face, right at the right time. Okay, so one quick thing before we jump to the next question. When you're targeting these different weed beds, this time of year in fall, you have that good weeds, those good weeds. Are the fish usually out on the edge or up in the weeds, or do you have to experiment? That all depends. You know, it all depends on temperature, on wind, the conditions, what type of lake it is, how much forage is in the lake. You know, I tend to fish shallow first and then work my way out.
Okay.
I do that all the time. I want to see if those fish are up tight. Generally if they're shallow, they're feeding. That's my mindset. So I'll fish shallow first, and then I'll come back and fish maybe that scattered weed edge or out along the weeds. Other things to look for are transitions. If you can find some rocks that are within those weeds, that's always a great spot to hold fish. Play the wind. If you're fishing walleyes, play the wind. If the wind's blowing into an area, blowing across a weed flat, something like that, you can work the edge of that weed flat and then kind of dissect those areas as you're fishing. And there's plenty of times where I'll be casting and working an area, and all of a sudden I see something on my graph, which I tend to fish with my boat out a little bit deeper, pitching up to those flats. As soon as I see something like a weed pocket or I mark a fish in that particular depth, I'm always laying down icons. So just being vigilant while you're fishing is always key. If I hook up on a fish, boom, I'm putting an icon down. I mean, that's your reference point. That's your tell, if you will, that telling you where the fish are at, and that's always key.
Very good. All right, question number 2. This one is from Joe Anderson, and it's about jigging wraps. And I know that you're a very good jigging wrap fisherman, so I thought this would be appropriate. Joe asks, I just started fishing jigging wraps, and I'm a little confused by the jigging motion I should be using. Do you need to keep the jig bouncing off the bottom? Should you wait for the jig to hit the bottom before starting the retrieve? Also, what is the ideal rod length?
All great questions. These are questions that I had when I first started using jigging wraps, and they're questions that I have when I use any new technique that I'm not confident in. I always say confidence starts with catching fish. The more fish you catch, the more situations you have under the belt, the more confident you're going to get in fishing those presentations. When it comes to jigging wraps, they're just one of those versatile baits that catch fish almost all year long. Jigging wrap, I used to say, is quickly becoming my go-to bait. It is one of my go-to baits. It's just one of those baits that catch walleyes. I can't tell you how many different situations I've been in where it produces walleyes when nothing else works. And so having said that, Joe, what I recommend is going out and just getting confident with jigging wraps is, like I was saying, do some blind casting where you're obviously using a 7-foot, I like to use like a 7-foot rod with medium action, something that, if I set the hook, you're going to make contact on that fish. You don't necessarily need a sensitive rod or that stereotypical, 6'2", 6'6", medium light rod. You want something with a little more backbone. I like something with a little more backbone. Now, having said that, I use either a 6 or 10-pound braid with a fluorocarbon leader. I tend to tie a swivel or a double uni knot. What I like about the swivel is it prevents those line twists, especially if you're working a jigging wrap all day long. But cast that bait out there, let it hit the bottom, and you can watch your braid, and then rip it, let it fall, rip it, let it fall. Now, when you're ripping and doing that ripping motion, it's really important that it's straight up in the air, okay? That you're not dragging it along the bottom, because if there's anything like rock, timber, scattered, let's say zebra mussels or snails or any debris on the bottom, you're going to be hooking up on that more, and your bait's not really doing what you want it to do. So, Joe, rip it straight up in the air, and then drop your rod tip back so it goes on a slack line, and watch your braid. Rip it, let it fall, just momentarily pause, rip it, let it fall on a slack line once again. And when you're doing that, sooner or later, a walleye is going to strike it. You're going to get more confident. Now, that's not the only way you can fish a jigging wrap. I've trolled them. I've had it where, let's say there's some loose sandgrass on the bottom, so I know my timing, so I'm actually ripping that bait just before it hits the bottom. That way I'm not getting hooked up on that sandgrass or some of those loose weeds, zebra mussels. But that sort of thing takes a little bit of time. But if you get comfortable just pitching that bait out, ripping it, letting it fall, ripping it, letting it fall, or if you're trolling along as well, let's say you're working an edge, at half mile an hour, just work on ripping it, letting it fall, and touching the bottom and watching that braid, ripping it, letting it fall, letting it touch the bottom momentarily. Especially if you've already graphed fish, you're going to get confident fishing jigging wraps, and you're going to put a ton of fish in the boat. Great.
So one question I hear a lot with jigging wraps too, and this helps with confidence if you kind of know what the best overall, I would say, size for the bait is. So what would you say is kind of like your go-to size that will work in most situations?
Number 7s and number 9s.
Okay.
I tend to use for walleyes anyway, number 7s and number 9s. Not to say that I haven't used smaller sizes, because The smaller sizes do work great for walleyes, panfish, etc. But numbers and 7s and number 9s. And as far as colors, what's great about Rapala is to make a wide variety of colors for almost every situation, everything from bright UVs to the most natural of colors. Key in on what the forage species are. I tend to fish a lot of yellow perch because in our waters there's just a ton of yellow perch, and that's their main forage species. But also I use a lot of the bright colors. I rely on the whites and the UVs, the UV pink tiger, green tiger. Those are all really good colors that put fish in the boat in stained water. So that's kind of how I go about selecting colors. If the water's really crystal clear, for example, and it's a high sun day, I'll tend to use more natural colors, the yellow perch, the blue chromes, those sort of things. If it's stained water or low light conditions, even just really, let's say it's a kind of a windy, rainy type of day, I'll tend to rely on more of the brighter colors when it comes to jigging wraps. But you'll quickly find that if you're over a school of fish and you pitch a color in there and it's not working and you switch colors, pretty soon you're going to find what's working, because there's very few situations where you're not catching them on a jigging wrap. So if you pitch it out there, you don't catch one, I tend to switch colors just like I do with crankbaits when I'm trolling until I find something that's going to work. That's
great stuff. Yeah, and so I asked that question because a lot of people, trying a new presentation is never easy, and I think a lot of the times if you get good guidance from somebody like you on a lot of the specific things, I think you can help with the confidence factor early on, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, anglers learn from other anglers. It's pretty evident. I learn from other anglers. I learn by watching things. I learn by doing things. And for me, confidence always comes with catching fish. I always say that in every seminar. And until you start catching fish, you have a lot of questions in your mind. But believe me, when it comes to jigging wraps, that's just a confidence bait for me. That ranks right up there with a lot of other baits when it comes to walleyes. And it shows. It's one of the fastest growing and selling categories for Rapala, and for good reason. It catches fish.
Absolutely. When I'm out walleye fishing, that's my number one bait personally. So okay, but let's jump on to question number 3 here, and this is a little bit of a different question, but similar in a lot of ways as well. And it's from Roger Brown, and he says, I have a lot of success with one specific crankbait color when I fish up on the rainy river. And there's a lot of guys who have their special color with their special bait. But so he goes on to ask, do you think color is the most important factor when it comes to choosing a crankbait? Or is it another factor such as action or cadence?
Roger, all of the above. I, like a lot of anglers, have certain go-to colors that are my confidence baits. Every angler has that color, because going back to that confidence and building confidence factor, it takes time to build confidence, and catching fish is a big part of that. However, being open to change sometimes can be the difference of catching fish and not catching fish. So what I like to do is I'll start with my confidence colors, for example, and then if I'm not getting them on that bait, instead of just forcing the issue, I'll quickly start changing colors. But even more of a factor than colors at time, before I decide to choose a specific crankbait, I'll look at surface temperature. I'll also look at forage species. What's the main forage species in the lake? Size, how big that forage is. If there's an abundance of young of the year perch, for example, I'm definitely going to a number 5 or a number 7 shad wrap. If you learn that most of the fish in the system are feeding on shiners or ciscos or something like that, I'm going to go to a different type of color. Water clarity plays a big role in what color I'm going to use that particular day or on that body of water. Also light, low light versus bright sunshine, that's going to play a factor of what color I'm going to choose. So those all go into the equation. Yes, I do have my go-to colors as well. However, I try to block out what my favorites are, because favorites can be dangerous in the sense that You might have a favorite bait or a favorite go-to color, but on, let's say, a different body of water or a different day, that might not be the bait you use. So in the spring, I tend to use a lot of baits that have a slow type of wobble, whether it's an original floater, a husky jerk, those wide wobble type of baits. As the water temperature starts to warm up, I go to more of a shad type of bait. Even bass crankbaits work tremendously well for walleyes, but kind of that faster action. Speed can play a crucial role in catching fish on crankbaits as well. So all of those factors going into my decision on what to use that particular day and that situation plays a big factor of me catching fish. And crankbaits, I mean, that's a question we could talk about all day long. Just pick up a Rapala catalog or go online and take a look at all the baits that Rapala sells. They do it for a reason, because there's a lot of different situations that you need a specific bait to catch fish. And sometimes it can be real specific, sometimes it can be pretty broad.
So as a follow-up to that, generally speaking, if you are doing one presentation, let's say you're casting a certain color crankbait or something, and you're not catching any fish, are you changing colors or changing baits first, style of bait?
Sometimes both,
it depends on what you're doing.
Yeah, there's times where trolling, for example, where you can run multiple rods at a time. It's nice because you have the luxury of being able to experiment with different rods. However, if you're casting, or in particular, Roger was talking about the Rainy River, which is in Minnesota, you can only use one line per person. And so I'll generally start with a color change first.
Okay.
If that's not working, I'll upsize my bait, and then I'll start experimenting with different profile baits. I use everything from jerk baits to bass baits to shad wraps to, there's a number of different baits that I use even in trolling situations that catch walleyes, and I'll start with my go-tos, if you will, like everybody else, but then I'm one to quickly change. If I'm not putting a fish in the boat, I'm changing pretty rapidly to try to figure out and solve that puzzle. Trolling crankbaits isn't much different than any other fishing style or presentation. I mean, it's all about patterning those fish and kind of piecing the puzzle together and figuring out what they want. That's the key. And that's what's fun to me about trolling. It's not the actual of reeling in the fish, but it's being the captain and figuring out in that situation, what do they want, and piecing that puzzle together until the point where you can't keep the lines in the water. I mean, that to me is the fun of trolling.
Right on. Well, that's a great answer for you there, Roger. And I think we're pretty much out of time, but I want to thank you for coming on here. And is there anywhere people could find you on the internet, or if they want to find out more about you, where should they go?
Yeah, you can go to roachesguideservice.com, Tony Roach Outdoors. Look me up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram.
All right, great stuff. Thanks for coming on, Tony.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good luck fishing, everybody.
And we will see you on the water. Keep on sending questions, and we will keep on answering them.